There's a policy change coming in 2026 that most law school applicants haven't even heard about yet, but it's going to change everything about how law school works. This is not rankings or bar passage rates or admissions criteria. It's about money. Because starting in 2026, the federal government is capping how much you can borrow for law school. And that's not just a financial detail, but it's a direct hit to the business model every law school relies on to stay open. Let me be specific here. Right now, if a law school charges $85,000 a year, most students don't even blink because they know they can borrow it. Through Stafford loans and Grad PLUS loans, the government picks up the tab. There is no hard limit and no one's checking your credit. No one's even asking whether your school's outcomes justify the cost. You could borrow $250,000, $300,000. Doesn't even matter what your post-grad salary might be. Doesn't matter if you have no financial literacy, no advisor, no backup plan. The money was there, so students took it. And that era is over. Starting July 1st, 2026, that blank check disappears. The government is capping graduate borrowing at $50,000 per year with a lifetime maximum of $200,000. No more borrow whatever you need, no more default safety net, and no more pretending this is someone else's problem. And this policy doesn't just affect future students. It reshapes the entire economics of legal education. Because when the borrowing limits change, everything else follows. How schools price their programs, who can afford to attend, who gets financial aid, who finishes law school without drowning in debt, and which schools can even keep their doors open. And so if you're applying to law school in the next few years, you're going to live through this shift in real time. And if your school that's built your entire model on the assumption that students can always cover the cost, you're going to be in trouble. That's why this isn't just a policy change, it's a turning point. And most people are not going to see it coming. Most will keep applying to law school like nothing's changed. And most schools will keep charging tuition like the old rules still apply. But the smart ones, the people paying attention, will see what's really happening. This is the biggest reset to legal education in over 20 years. And those who understand it early will be the ones who make the best decisions with the least regret. Now, let's break down the new policy line by line so you're not just hearing buzzwords like loan caps and Grad PLUS reform without knowing what they really mean. For decades, the way law students paid for school was simple, at least on paper. First, you'd take out Stafford loans, fixed federal loans with relatively low limits, about $20,500 per year. Then, you'd fill in the rest using Grad PLUS loans, which had no cap other than total cost of attendance that your school set. And that cost of attendance included everything: tuition, fees, housing, transportation, even a budget for books and personal expenses. Your school would estimate it, say, $90,000 for the year, and the government would just give you the loan. No cosigner, no income check, no financial counseling, just an online form and a signature. That's what made Grad PLUS so powerful and dangerous. It removed every friction point from the borrowing process. You didn't need savings. You didn't need parents with money. You didn't even need a plan. You just got the money. And that system ends on July 1st, 2026. Here is what's replacing it: a $50,000 annual borrowing cap from all federal sources, including Stafford and Grad PLUS combined for graduate students. A $200,000 lifetime borrowing limit for all graduate loans combined. If your law school costs $85,000 a year and you have no savings, you've got a gap of at least $35,000 per year, and federal loans are not going to cover it. And one more thing, by the way, Parent PLUS loans are being phased out too. That means your parents can't step in and take out additional federal loans on your behalf. It means that for the first time in decades, law students will actually have to think about how they'll pay for school and not just assume the government's going to spot them the full amount. So if you're entering law school in fall 2026 or beyond, this affects you directly. You're going to be the first class to come in under the new cap. You'll have to budget within that $50,000 per year federal limit. You'll have to decide whether private loans are worth the risk. More on that in a bit. And you'll possibly have to reevaluate which schools are even financially realistic. So this is not just a minor tweak. This isn't just, oh well, guess I'll have to tighten my belt a little. This is the government drawing a hard line. They're saying, we will not fund law schools indefinitely at any cost with no oversight. And if you're applying now to start 1L in 2026, you are the test case. Now, let's talk about law school pricing and how this one change exposes the entire system. Because here's the dirty secret. Law school tuition is not based on what the education costs. It's based on what law schools think students can pay. And until now, what students can pay has been code for whatever the federal government will loan them. That's why tuition has gotten so out of control. I mean, take a typical private law school, for example. They charge something like $68,000 in tuition, $2,500 in fees, and $20,000 for estimated living expenses. That adds up to over $90,000 per year. But almost nobody actually pays that because law schools don't operate like normal businesses. They don't have fixed pricing. They do what economists call price discrimination. They charge different students different prices based on their perceived ability to pay. It works like this. If you have a high LSAT and a high GPA, they're going to give you a scholarship, aka a discount, to attract you. If you're from a wealthy family or you don't negotiate, you might pay full price. If you're low income, first gen or international, you might pay more than somebody with worse stats simply because you didn't know you could even ask. And all of that works because of one thing: unlimited Grad PLUS loans. As long as the federal government was willing to lend students the full cost of attendance, schools had no reason to lower tuition because there was no market pressure to do so. No parents asking, is this actually worth it? No banks saying, hold on, your grads are only making $52,000 a year. Why are you charging $270,000 for a degree? No students saying, I can't afford this, because the loan approval was automatic. So schools naturally inflated their sticker prices, handed out scholarships like coupons, and built their budgets around the assumption that every admitted student could borrow whatever they needed. That system ends in July 2026, because once you cap loans at $50,000 a year, that tuition fantasy collapses. Let's say you get into a school that costs $90,000 a year. You qualify for the full $50,000 in federal loans. Great. But that still leaves you with a $40,000 shortfall per year. Over 3 years, that's $120,000 in costs that you now have to cover some other way. Private loans are risky and not guaranteed. Personal savings? Most people just don't have that kind of cash sitting around. Family support is not available to everybody, and working during school is not really a viable path forward because law schools strongly discourage it, and it's hard to make $40,000 a year while also studying in law school full-time. So now, students are going to start asking harder questions. Is this law school worth it? What are its actual job outcomes? How much do graduates make in their first year? And can I get into a lower cost option and still reach my goals? These are the kinds of questions law schools have never wanted to answer directly. But once these loan caps hit, they're not going to have a choice, because the old system with high sticker prices, hidden discounts, unlimited loans, it only worked when nobody had to think too hard about the price. And now, everybody will. So let's get real about who this change actually hits the hardest and who, surprisingly, might benefit. Because when people hear loan caps, they assume it's bad news for low-income students, that it closes doors, that it limits opportunity. But if you zoom out, the opposite might actually be true. The students who've been getting hurt most under the current system are the ones who've been borrowing the most for the schools that offer them the least. Let's walk through who these students are. They're often first-gen applicants who don't have a parent or older sibling who went to grad school. They might be from working-class backgrounds, and law school looks like a ticket to financial security. They don't always know how to evaluate risk. They see a top 100 law school logo, and they assume it means job stability. They might not have access to financial coaching, loan calculators, or someone who's been through it all before. So what happens? They get into a school ranked number 87, with a 59% bar passage rate and a median starting salary of $50,000. The school offers them zero scholarship money, but says not to worry because you can just take out loans. So they do. They borrow $250,000 or more to attend a school that barely places half its graduates in JD-required jobs. No one really explains how repayment's going to work. No one says what 7% interest means in practice. And no one tells them that private sector salaries won't come anywhere close to paying that off. And when they graduate, they're staring down 6 figures of debt. They might not pass the bar on the first try. They might end up in a non-legal job making $42,000 as a compliance associate or a contracts admin. And they have no real path out of the debt because student loans, both federal and private, follow you for life. Here's what most people don't understand. Student loans are uniquely punishing. You can't get rid of them in bankruptcy. You can't pause them just because you're unemployed. And the standard for getting relief, legally called undue hardship, is so high that courts have rejected even terminally ill borrowers. So when you cap federal loans at $50,000 a year, what you're really doing is putting a hard stop on that debt pipeline. You're saying, if your law school isn't good enough to justify its price, you can't just pass the risk onto the student and let the government cover the tab. That forces students to look harder at value, not just admissions. And in a weird way, this protects the most vulnerable because it stops a predatory cycle where schools can charge whatever they want, offer nothing in return, and still get paid in full by the federal loan system. Now, to be clear, some students will have fewer options because of this. A student who gets into a great law school but doesn't qualify for aid and has no outside support might find themselves short on funding. But even that's an invitation to make smarter choices, to ask, do I really need to go this year? And to consider lower cost schools, part-time programs, or applying with a higher LSAT score to unlock merit aid. So yes, this change does remove an option. But the option it removes is unlimited, unthinking, no questions asked debt, which has wrecked far more careers than it has helped. And in that light, this is consumer protection, not a punishment. Now, let's shift the spotlight because while this loan cap might seem like it's aimed at students, the real pressure lands squarely on the law schools themselves, especially the ones that have gotten comfortable charging luxury prices without delivering luxury outcomes. Here's why. For the last few decades, law schools have been playing a high-stakes game of enroll now and worry later. They admitted students who couldn't afford tuition on paper because it didn't matter. The government would cover it. Grad PLUS loans filled in every financial gap. No credit check, no real limit, no strings attached. If the school said the cost of attendance was $91,000, you could borrow exactly $91,000. No questions asked. So the schools never had to adjust their pricing based on actual market demand. They were not constrained by what students or families could realistically pay. They just set the number and the government enabled all of it. Now that safety net is gone, and the schools that relied on unlimited loans to pad their budgets are now facing a serious reckoning. When Grad PLUS disappears, 3 things are going to happen instantly. First, the cost is going to become real. Students will no longer look at $90,000 a year and think to themselves, I'll just borrow it. They'll have to figure out how to cover a $40,000 gap every single year. And for most students, especially those without generational wealth or outside support, that is a deal breaker. Secondly, yield becomes unpredictable. Yield is, from the school's perspective, the percentage of students they admit who actually enroll. And that number is going to get a lot harder to predict because students will apply, get accepted, and then realize, too late, that they can't afford to attend. Schools will likely see more accepted students turning them down, choosing cheaper options, or deferring for a year to save money. And third, financial aid budgets will get stretched thin. Schools will need to give more aid to more students, not just the top 10% with high LSAT scores. Because now, it's not just a nice to have. It's a requirement if you want someone to enroll. That puts pressure on endowments, alumni donations, and general operating budgets. And here's who gets hit the hardest. private law schools without massive endowments. These are the schools that charged Ivy League prices without offering Ivy League outcomes. It's also going to hit lower-ranked schools with weak bar passage or job placement rates. Now, of course, up to this point, students have been willing to take a chance because they could just borrow everything. Now, not so much. This will also disproportionately affect schools with a high percentage of students with financial need. These are the schools whose students most relied on Grad PLUS loans to close the financial gap. In short, the schools that depended on unlimited lending to keep enrollment high and revenue flowing are the ones most in trouble. And remember, this is all happening as the demographic cliff hits. There are going to be fewer college graduates entering the pipeline. That means more competition for fewer applicants and less room for error. So, what happens next? Some schools will shrink their class sizes just to stay alive. Some will merge with universities that can absorb the cost. Some will quietly close their doors, blaming changing applicant trends rather than financial collapse. And a handful are going to panic, lowering admission standards to fill seats, which only makes the outcomes worse. Bar passage rates will drop, job placement will tank, and their reputations are going to erode. And this is not theoretical. This has already happened in the for-profit law school space. And now, the same financial math is creeping up the rankings. In the old system, law schools could pretend money wasn't a limiting factor. Now it is. And unless a school has real value, not glossy brochures, but actual outcomes, they're going to feel the consequences first. Now, some schools and applicants are already trying to downplay the impact of the loan cap. Their go-to response is that private lenders will step in. Don't worry, the market's going to figure it out. But that's not how this works. Private student loans are not a plug-and-play substitute for Grad PLUS, and pretending they are is either wishful thinking or willful denial. Because private loans aren't guaranteed. With federal loans, everybody qualifies. You fill out a form, you're automatically approved, that's it. Private loans are based on risk. If you have a low credit score, limited credit history, or no cosigner, you might get denied. And even if you get approved, your terms will likely be much worse than what federal loans offered. Some students might get 9% interest. Others might see 12% or higher. And we're not even talking about the hidden origination fees yet. So right off the bat, the people who need the money the most, students without family wealth, financial history, or cosigners, are the least likely to qualify. It's also worth noting that private lenders look at the specific school. And this part shocks people, but banks aren't dumb. They do their homework. If you're attending a school with poor bar passage rates, low employment outcomes, high dropout risk, no name recognition, the lender may deny the loan altogether, or they might cap how much you can borrow regardless of what you need. Yes, the lender is judging your school, not just you. So if you're enrolled at a school with a shaky track record, you might get hit with high rates, lower loan limits, or a flat-out rejection. That means the schools most dependent on Grad PLUS, the ones with weaker outcomes, are the least likely to be rescued by private lenders. Also worth noting that there are known protections. Federal loans might be flawed, but they came with guardrails: income-driven repayment, public service loan forgiveness, temporary deferments and forbearance options, death and disability discharge, and even limited cancellation options for teachers, government employees, and others. But private loans offer none of that. If you get sick, tough. If you lose your job, doesn't matter. Even if you die, your family might still be on the hook, especially if they co-signed. There's no public service loan forgiveness, no income-driven options, no automatic forbearance. It's just debt, pure and simple, with all the consequences and none of the protections. And even bankruptcy still won't help. Private student loans are still protected from discharge and bankruptcy. So if your career doesn't take off, if your law degree never pays off the way you hoped, you're stuck. And private lenders know this, which is why they're more selective than you'd expect. They don't want to lend to students chasing a dream that might not pay off, especially at schools where that dream is statistically unlikely. And there's also a deeper reason private loans won't replace Grad PLUS fully. Because they were never meant to. Grad PLUS existed to support access to education even when it wasn't financially safe. This was a public policy choice. But private loans are a business and lenders want repayment. They want predictable, low-risk borrowers attending high-yield programs. That's not the profile of a student going $270,000 in debt to attend a Tier 4 law school with 58% employment outcomes. So while private loans might fill the gap for a few high credit score students attending a name brand school, they're not a system-wide solution, and they never were. And now that federal policy is tightening, we're going to see exactly how limited that backup really is. So far, this might all sound like doom and gloom. Loan caps, budget gaps, schools at risk of closing, students scrambling to fund their degrees. But if you take a step back, it starts to look exactly like the wake-up call legal education has needed for years. Because what we had before wasn't working. We had a system where schools could set prices with zero accountability. Students could borrow six figures with no real vetting. And bar passage rates and job outcomes were ignored because the money always showed up anyway. And unlimited Grad PLUS wasn't really financial aid. It was a blank check. And that blank check allowed law schools to operate in a fantasy world where tuition could rise every single year, even if job outcomes got worse. Scholarships were used as marketing tools, not need-based support. And students were encouraged to focus on fit and prestige, not cost, debt, and return on investment. This wasn't generosity, it was institutional laziness. Why would a law school build a more efficient program when the government's going to cover the bloated budget? Why compete on pricing when your competitor students can borrow just as much? Why worry about outcomes when loan forgiveness and 25-year repayment plans can make the debt feel abstract? Unlimited lending created the illusion that price didn't matter. But it always mattered. The system just offloaded the consequences onto students, especially the students least prepared to manage six figures of debt. And that's the heart of the issue. The most vulnerable students, the ones who didn't have financial advisors, parents with grad school experience, or a safety net, those were the students most likely to overborrow for a degree with uncertain value. It's not just about who borrowed, it's about who was allowed to believe it was safe. This new cap breaks that illusion. It says, we're not going to subsidize bad decisions with unlimited public money. And yes, that's going to force hard conversations. Applicants will need to do real math before accepting an offer, compare cost against job placement data, not just rankings, and push back on inflated tuition and meaningless scholarships. Schools will need to cut waste, rebalance their aid strategies, and prove they're worth the price they're charging. That's not scary, that's overdue. This change doesn't kill opportunity, it brings true transparency. It forces law schools to compete on value, not just marketing. It forces applicants to make informed decisions, not just emotional ones. And it forces everyone in the system to take financial responsibility seriously. Because when the money isn't unlimited, the questions get sharper. Is this school truly worth it? Will this degree pay off? What am I actually getting for $250,000? Those are the right questions, and this policy change is going to force people to ask them. Now let's talk about the next 5 years, because this isn't just a policy change. It's the start of a full system reset. We are about to see the gap widen, not just between rich and poor students, but between smart schools and naive schools, between schools that can adapt and schools that collapse slowly while pretending nothing's changed. Here's what you're going to watch for. The first big trend is fewer high-debt borrowers, and this one starts immediately. Students will self-regulate in a way they've never had to before. They're going to run the numbers, they're going to cap their own borrowing, and they'll walk away from schools that don't offer meaningful aid. The idea of taking out $250,000 in debt for a non-T14 degree will become a red flag, not a rite of passage. You'll see students saying, I'm not taking on that kind of risk unless the outcomes justify it. And that single mindset shift will ripple across every admissions cycle. The second big trend to look for is shrinking enrollment at lower tier schools. Law schools in the bottom half of the rankings will feel the pressure first. They have historically relied on two things: students who are willing to attend any school that says yes to them, and the government covering the full bill, no matter how inflated. Both of those pillars are crumbling. Fewer students will apply. Even fewer will enroll. And many of those schools simply don't have the financial or reputational capital to survive a drop in class size. You're not going to see mass closures right away, but you will start to see class sizes quietly shrinking, faculty layoffs, mergers with larger institutions, and campuses restructuring or going fully online. It's not going to be dramatic, but it will be constant. The third big trend you'll see is upfront pricing as a replacement for all these scholarship games that schools love to play. Because right now, most law schools play the quiet discount game behind the scenes. They advertise tuition of $80,000 a year, then quietly hand out $30,000 a year scholarships to more than half the class based on LSAT score, yield protection, or negotiation skill. But once loan caps hit, that model breaks down. Because if a student knows they'll have to make up a shortfall out of pocket, they're going to need clarity, not coupons. Expect to see schools shift toward flat rate pricing, transparent aid packages, and simplified financial disclosures. Not because they want to, but because they'll have no choice. Students will demand to know, what will this actually cost me over 3 years? And the schools that can't clearly answer that question will lose applicants. The fourth big trend you'll see is a shift in applicant priorities. The U.S. News rankings up to this point have driven everything. Students would chase a school ranked 54 over one ranked 68, even if the lower ranked school offered them a full ride. Now we're going to see a different equation. Cost and outcomes will weigh more heavily than rankings and branding. Applicants will start asking, what is the average debt load at graduation? How many grads are employed in JD required jobs within 10 months? What is the median starting salary? And will this degree help me pass the bar? This mindset shift from prestige to return on investment will reshape admissions, slowly at first, then all at once. Now, the fifth and final big trend is that diversity challenges will get real, and this is the uncomfortable truth. Under the old system, many schools claimed to support diversity while relying on Grad PLUS loans to fund that diversity. They admitted high-need, first-gen or underrepresented students without offering real aid and let the federal government handle the gap. That approach is not going to work anymore. Now, if a school wants to maintain a diverse student body, it's going to have to reallocate scholarship dollars based on need, tap endowments and alumni giving for underrepresented applicants, and actually compete to retain top diverse candidates who have other affordable options. In short, you can't just admit diverse candidates, you have to fund them as well. And that will separate the schools that say the right things from the ones that do the right things. Now, to be clear, and it's worth saying this directly, unlimited Grad PLUS loans were never sustainable. And this is the part no one wants to say out loud. Not the schools, not the financial aid offices, and definitely not the consultants making money on the old model. For years, law schools have operated in a bubble. Not an academic bubble, a financial one. And the only reason that bubble didn't pop sooner is because the federal government kept injecting oxygen through Grad PLUS loans. It didn't matter how much the school charged. It didn't matter what your job prospects looked like. It didn't matter if the median starting salary was $54,000 a year and the debt load was $230,000. You could still borrow. And that's not education, that's subsidized delusion. And here's the uncomfortable truth. We knew this wasn't going to last. You cannot run a national professional education system where schools set prices with zero risk and students absorb all the downside. It was only a matter of time before someone said, this makes no sense, we need limits. And now it's happening. And everything downstream is going to change. Let's make this real. Law schools can't keep raising tuition every year because inflation. They can't keep handing out 60-page glossy brochures to first-gen applicants while offering zero aid. And they can't keep pretending the answer to how will I pay for this is just borrow more. Because now the money is running out. And now students are hitting a hard ceiling. And that means every assumption built on unlimited borrowing collapses with it. Schools that want to survive need to rebuild their models from the ground up. That means cutting the bloat, getting serious about employment outcomes, pricing based on reality, not wishful thinking, offering real need-based aid, proving in hard numbers that the degree leads somewhere worth going. That's not just better for students. That's better for everyone who wants legal education to be more than a branding exercise. Because the real scandal wasn't that students could borrow too much. The real scandal was that schools could charge whatever they wanted and push the risk onto 24-year-olds who didn't know any better. And that era is ending. Not all at once, but steadily. And what comes next? The schools that adapt will come out stronger, leaner, clearer, more aligned with student outcomes. And the schools that don't, they'll keep talking about prestige while their applicants disappear. And the students will finally be forced to ask the questions they should have been asking all along. What's the real cost? What's the real value? And who's really on the hook when it doesn't pay off? That's not a crisis, that's clarity, and it's long overdue.